And I would encourage you, and I would encourage the other artists to take your questions, the things that really bother you. You don't think there is a God? Then say it. Ask your question. What have you to be afraid of? God is quite capable of looking after himself. Lots of personal things happen to me. I'm 73. Lots of personal things have happened to me also. At one point, because I'm working in Britain, and the things I had learned in the arts, I apply with my students, I applied to my daughters. For example, I'm sure I made a mistake somewhere, but I tried never to talk to them or to assess them on the basis of how they looked. I wanted them to understand whether they achieved well intellectually or not. We wanted them to achieve, but it wasn't on the basis of how they looked or whatever. I wanted you to do it because that was it. It was according to your gift, and develop your gifts. So even when I was angry with them, I tried to be extremely careful not to do that. Even with Janet, that's my wife, and I tried never to do that kind of thing, but always to encourage and just not insult. And then when you're applying it to your students and you're working with your students, and at one point, you're coaching basketball. How do you build these guys? And you can't be doing it with sugar. If a guy's looking like he's dribbling down the court like a sack of potatoes, he's dropping potatoes, I think it goes, not good. And you just tell him bluntly, that was really awful, whatever. But you don't judge him by what you wanted him to do, but you never taught him. You teach them what you'd like them to achieve. Then you can criticize after they begin to, you give them the drills to help them develop the habits or whatever. And we did what we had learned on the basketball court, we applied to the classroom. I'm saying, the things that we were learning in church, we were learning in the scriptures, we were learning in the Bible study lessons. I've never had Bible study lessons like some that I've had here in America, where it's like, you don't ask questions like that. Can't you see the guys trying to teach the lesson? I said, what lesson, right? If nobody's learning, what are you teaching? What good is it to me if I can't use it in my life? What kind of God is it? Is he so abstract? But I learned about my humanity. I learned, the Presbyterians, you have some of these guys that look at you even now as if, a person of color, did God allow you to be born? I says, gee, thanks a lot. But with that kind of, attitude, I said, I'm stunned. I said, were you not the one who taught me that I too am made in the image of God? Why are you shocked that I'm able to achieve what I achieve? Right? And you've seen and you heard some of the stuff that this culture here in America was teaching about how blacks were incapable of contemplative thought. And I often think, oh my goodness, I really would have appreciated it if you told me that before I got depressed. Right? And then I could have lived a happier life. But, like, when I'm looking at these two girls, this photograph, I says, and I made that, oh my God, it was like you caught the moment. It was like, for me, it was a moment of just great celebration. I've been waiting all my life for this moment. Boom, got it. And I'm seeing it. And other folk probably have a little more wisdom than me. And I thought I was the world's authority on my work. Maybe I'm not. Anyway, they said, you were there before. And I said, no, I wasn't. I was searching, I was looking. And I'm still looking, but it seems like more and more is happening now. And I'd encourage the artists on that point also, is to say, well, some things like a good wine get better with age. If you're a Baptist, take our word for it. All right? Don't drink the wine. Just remember, I'll tell you, some wines get better with age. Because the world needs what you have to say, what you're trying to find out. The thing that I found very shocking in the middle of all this was that the people who were not believers just responded. The critics, whatever. Even from the beginning, they were looking at us. And it says, this guy's work, it's not too sweet, it's not too ugly, whatever. and they were finding a kind of balance. I was just quite surprised that they just seemed to be able to see it. You know, even the farmer looking at the work, and he's seeing it. He hadn't been to art school or had any, great artistic vocabulary, but he said, "Oh my goodness, these people look like they could just walk right off there." And for me, that was extremely important because I had a difficulty with metaphor. It took years before I reached C.S. Lewis and where we were coming from, for whatever reason, in my own background. This metaphor. I says, "You're not kidding me." And so I think the surrealism, or Salvador Dali, had more of an idea about what Christ was like, like where you could see right through the Christ, the crucifixion is floating, and it was just so exciting to realize that this had taken place in space and time and in history. And if I'd been standing there, I could have gotten blood on my clothes, I would have seen it, I would have heard the screams, the jeering, the cynicism, and this is what our world is like, and this is the way we should talk about it. We need to understand it. But what happens is that when we go to that place, now it was extreme. It's not that this is the only form or the way of talking about the world. There are other ways of talking about it, and it was brilliant to be living and working, with the art, with the poets, the writers, the musicians, the singers, the architects. There were just so many different kinds of artists all around us there in Europe, and I took an education. Even when I came in to teach, I had the qualifications that were equivalent of a PhD. I don't know. Okay, I'll take it. But we talked about these things, visually, even though you couldn't talk about it. Let's say, if I was commissioned to do the book on England, but I didn't talk about my personal theology, yet I did. In many ways, we were talking about these things, but to bring it back, when you saw the hobo, when you saw the queen, you saw the elephant, I was more impressed with their humanity than their status. And it was tough moving like that, from one place to the other, or from one group to another group. And you were always the outsider who was on the inside, which is quite a fascinating experience. But it was always, always, always encouraging and astounding that the unbelievers seemed to grasp what was going on when we walk in a way that is so realistic, that touches the real world, as opposed to that superficial world where we have to pretend everything is nice and it's always going to be good for us here in this life as believers. And it's just not the case. Some of us die, some of us have great pain, all kinds of things that are happening to us. And these guys just related to it as well. And I thought, well, if it's going like that, sure, I'll take it. I always wanted to be I always felt a little bit like Tavia. Would it destroy some vast eternal plan if I were a rich man? Maybe it would. I never got there. But at the same time, there was this little movie that Nike had produced. And they'd asked these 5, 6 great photographers, big photographers, to photograph this fellow. And they told each of them he was somebody different. And they all photographed him differently. I don't know how on earth that would be framed for me, but I would love to do that kind of thing. You tell me he was a thief, and over here you tell me he was a rich man, or whatever. It says, would my photographs of the rich man be different from the photographs of the poor man, of the one who was evil, of the one who was great, of the one who was famous? Would they be the same? Actually, in my book on England, I'm also dealing with that. So I put the unknown. Okay, I put the unknown next to the one who is known. the one who is famous with the one who is unknown, the one who is poor. Right? There was a portrait section in there. I don't know if you've noticed, but it was dealing with that issue without saying I'm dealing with this issue, and I was intrigued. Even again recently, looking at that book, the book on England, where the British Council took that book to promote England, and we got a prize. They obviously used it because it was the work of an artist, not because it was a glossy, glitzy commercial piece. That is not a glossy commercial piece. That was there used to promote Britain. Because some of the things in there are pretty rough. So they were obviously using that, as an artist. But I can't say, look, if you do it the way I did it, God is going to work with you like this, because you don't know. God has not given us a template. My life is not a template for you or yours for me. Just do what God has given us to do and have the guts. Sometimes you don't feel like it. And right now, at this stage, I feel like, kidding. I've had enough of striving on behalf of my ego. I'm tired of that. I'd love to help, to encourage a lot of artists. We saw that movie, Midnight in Paris. Actually, that's the only Woody Allen movie I think I ever really, really enjoyed. Because, you go back, at midnight, suddenly he was in this other world with the other artists who'd gone before. Whereas, in that movie, mentally, psychologically, it was like stepping back in time. Because now I had studied and had absorbed, without realizing it, that tradition. But I had opted for that Protestant one, the Dutch 17th century and 16th century, as opposed to that of the Impressionist or the other, but you hadn't rejected this. And a strange kind of curiosity is that I knew the children of some of these people, and they were friends. And the men and women who had studied and were masters of these were like relatives. They are like relatives. And so it was like a little biography of our lives. But what we want is to make a biography of our time, where we are encouraging the church and the others to do it. At this point, I'm saying to the other artists, please do your bit. Here in America, because if you're white and you're in this group, so some of you are going to have access to a lot of money and to a lot of privilege and a lot of resources. You don't curse that. God has given it to you as a gift. But our problem, our sin, is that if you're white in this kind of situation, you will the temptation is to think it's just for your personal use. Your personal youth. Well, and it is there for some of us, for you and your youth. But it's not just for you. You have a responsibility to the rest of the church and also to the world around you. What are you going to do with the gift that God has given you? Not all of us will have to work at it because you were black or because you didn't get the opportunity. So I can laugh and say, you get some sound bites. So I can laugh and say, hey, that was not my privilege. But mind you, in Europe sometimes it was as if it were my privilege. I was still black, but now I had privilege that I didn't have when I was growing up. And so I'm in this gallery, but also I'm before this group. I can talk. I still have no money, but but I'm here, and we can talk, we can encourage and help and build. And so I laugh. You say, well, I didn't have that. Thank you very much. But at the same time, still had an opportunity. So it was great to be creative and come from underneath and still stand there. And sometimes I can say, look, guys, I'm outperforming you. without your privilege, you ought to get up and go to work. This should not be happening. Right? Should I stop here?